December 14th, 1941, 7:30 a.m., Washington, D.C., Munitions Building. George Catlett Marshall sat at a desk covered with reports that documented catastrophe in a language of numbers and unit designations, each page smelling of mimeograph ink and the particular staleness of documents produced faster than anyone could read them. The coffee in his cup had gone cold 2 hours earlier. The cigarette smoke that hung in the air came from staff officers who moved through his outer office with a controlled urgency of men who understood that the world had changed and that the man behind this desk would determine what the change meant. Marshall was 61 years old, the son of a coal merchant from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, who had raised his boy to believe that duty was not a word but a way of living. He had graduated from the Virginia Military Institute in 1901, had served in the Philippines, had spent the First World War as a staff officer whose organizational abilities impressed everyone except the promotion boards that kept him at colonel's rank for 16 years. He had never led troops in combat. He had never commanded a division or a corps or an army in the field. What he understood was how to build military institutions, how to select commanders, how to transform the chaotic energy of American industrial democracy into organized violence on a scale the world had never witnessed. 1 week earlier, Japanese aircraft had destroyed the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The reports on Marshall's desk documented losses that would have paralyzed lesser nations. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, nearly 200 aircraft destroyed, over 2,000 sailors and soldiers killed in an attack that lasted less than 2 hours. The strategic assumptions that had governed American military planning for 2 decades had been invalidated in a single morning. The Navy that was supposed to project American power across the Pacific was burning in the shallow waters of a Hawaiian harbor. The Army that was supposed to defend American territories was watching Japanese forces advance across islands whose garrisons could not be reinforced or evacuated. Franklin Roosevelt had summoned Marshall to the White House 3 days after the attack and given him authority that no American general had held since George Washington commanded the Continental Army. Marshall would oversee the mobilization of an army that currently numbered 1.5 million men into a force that would eventually exceed 8 million. He would coordinate with allies whose interests conflicted with American priorities. He would allocate resources across theaters separated by oceans, balancing demands from commanders whose egos matched their abilities. He would do all of this while managing a president who understood politics better than military operations and a Congress whose members believed that their constituents' opinions should influence strategic decisions. The authority was unprecedented. The responsibility was crushing. Marshall accepted both with the same measured demeanor he had maintained throughout a career that had taught him to conceal whatever emotions might interfere with judgment. He did not celebrate the power he had been given. He calculated what the power required and began organizing systems to exercise it effectively. 6,000 miles to the east, another supreme commander was exercising authority over military forces that dwarfed what Marshall currently controlled. Stalin commanded an army of over 5 million soldiers, the largest military establishment on Earth, from a Kremlin office where generals stood at attention while Stalin questioned their decisions and implied consequences that everyone understood without explicit statement. Stalin's methods bore no resemblance to Marshall's. Where Marshall delegated, Stalin controlled. Where Marshall trusted subordinates to execute broad directives, Stalin demanded approval of division movements and artillery placements. Where Marshall selected commanders for competence and defended their decisions against political interference, Stalin selected commanders for loyalty and executed those whose competence produced independent reputations. Both systems would produce victory. The cost of that victory, measured not in soldiers' lives, but in the survival of the commanders who achieved it, would reveal something essential about the men who built them. Marshall's generals would retire with honors. Stalin's generals would retire to unmarked graves or obscure exile. The difference was not effectiveness. The difference was what supreme command meant to the men who held it. January 7, 1942, 2:15 a.m., Moscow, the Kremlin, Stalin's working office. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov stood at attention before a desk covered with maps that smelled of the pipe tobacco Stalin smoked continuously and the particular mustiness of paper that had been handled by men whose hands trembled slightly when they touched it. The office was warm, almost uncomfortably so, heated against the Moscow winter that had helped destroy German armies but could not penetrate these walls. The only sounds were the ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece and the soft scratch of Stalin's pencil as he marked positions on a map showing the central sector of the front. Zhukov was 45 years old, the son of a cobbler from a village called Strelkovka, 60 miles southwest of Moscow. He had been apprenticed to a furrier at age 11, had learned to work leather into shapes that wealthy women wore against the cold. The revolution had given him a different trade. He had risen through the Red Army by demonstrating abilities that the purges had not eliminated, had commanded the forces that stopped the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, had organized the defense of Leningrad, had planned the December counteroffensive that pushed German forces back from Moscow's suburbs. His survival was not guaranteed by his victories. His survival was permitted by them, provisionally, until Stalin decided that survival was no longer convenient. The summons had come 3 hours earlier, delivered by an NKVD officer whose expression conveyed nothing except the expectation of immediate compliance. Zhukov had dressed in his best uniform, understanding appearance mattered in meetings where substance could not protect him. He had been driven through streets where snow fell on rubble that German bombs had created, past buildings whose windows were dark because blackout regulations prohibited light that might guide enemy aircraft. The Kremlin's corridors had been nearly empty at this hour, populated only by guards, and the particular silence that accumulated in places where powerful men made decisions that determined whether other men lived or died. Stalin did not look up when Zhukov entered. The Supreme Commander continued studying his maps, making notations in a handwriting that staff officers had learned to decipher because asking for clarification invited suspicion. Minutes passed. Zhukov remained at attention, his back straight, his eyes fixed on a point above Stalin's head, his breathing controlled against the anxiety that even successful generals felt in this room. The waiting was not accidental. The waiting was a technique, a method of establishing dominance that required no words and permitted no response. When Stalin finally spoke, his questions concerned matters that Zhukov had addressed in written reports submitted through proper channels. The Supreme Commander wanted to know why a particular division had been positioned north of its assigned sector. He wanted to know why artillery ammunition had been distributed according to a schedule that differed from the schedule he had approved. He wanted to know whether the commander of a rifle corps could be trusted, a question whose answer might determine whether that commander saw another sunrise. The questions were detailed, specific, granular. They demonstrated that Stalin had read every report, had memorized unit dispositions, had tracked ammunition expenditures with the attention that accountants devoted to financial ledgers. Zhukov answered carefully, choosing words that provided information without implying that the Supreme Commander's previous orders had been inadequate. The art of responding to Stalin was the art of being right without making Stalin wrong, of providing expertise without suggesting expertise was necessary, of demonstrating competence without threatening the fiction that Stalin's genius required no supplementation. Marshals who forgot this art did not remain marshals. They became entries in files that documented enemies of the state. The AM meeting lasted until 4:30 a.m. Stalin approved operations that Zhukov had planned, modified details that did not require modification, questioned decisions that had already proven successful. The approval was not trust. The approval was permission that could be revoked at any moment, for any reason, without explanation or appeal. Zhukov left the Kremlin as the winter sky began lightening toward a dawn that German soldiers would experience as another day of frozen misery. He had survived another meeting. He would plan another operation. The pattern would continue until victory or until Stalin decided that victory required a different general. The man who embodied Franklin Roosevelt's opposite approach to power had never worn a military uniform, had never commanded troops, had never studied strategy at any academy or staff college. Harry Hopkins controlled more resources than most generals in history, shaped decisions that determined the survival of nations, and exercised authority that terrified the career officials who watched him operate from an office in the White House itself. He had acquired this power through a single qualification that Roosevelt valued above all others. Roosevelt trusted him completely. Hopkins was 51 years old in January 1942, a gaunt figure whose chronic illness had reduced him to a physical condition that doctors considered incompatible with the demands he placed upon himself. He had been born in Sioux City, Iowa, the son of a harness maker who moved the family repeatedly as business ventures failed and new opportunities beckoned. The young Hopkins had studied at Grinnell College, had discovered a talent for social work that led him to New York City's settlement houses, had spent 20 years helping poor families navigate systems designed to ignore them. He had never sought wealth. He had never accumulated power. He had simply solved problems that others found intractable, and Franklin Roosevelt had noticed. The relationship between Roosevelt and Hopkins defied the organizational charts that bureaucrats maintained and the constitutional principles that scholars invoked. Hopkins held no cabinet position. He had resigned as Secretary of Commerce in 1940, his health too fragile for formal duties. Yet he lived in the White House, occupied a bedroom on the second floor, ate meals with the Roosevelt family, and participated in decisions that cabinet secretaries learned about only after they had been made. His access to the president was unlimited. His influence over policy was immeasurable. His authority derived entirely from the trust of one man who happened to be the most powerful leader in the democratic world. Roosevelt had appointed Hopkins to run the Lend-Lease program in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor transformed American policy from cautious assistance to total war. The program would eventually transfer over $50 billion in military equipment to Allied nations, the equivalent of nearly $700 billion in later currency. Hopkins administered this transfer with a staff that career military officers considered inadequate and procedures that procurement specialists considered irregular. He made decisions in hours that normal bureaucratic processes would have required months to approve. He cut through regulations that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of arbitrary authority he exercised. He did this because Roosevelt had told him to, and because Roosevelt defended every decision Hopkins made against every challenge that arose. The philosophy underlying this delegation revealed something essential about how Roosevelt understood leadership. He believed that organizations functioned best when exceptional individuals received exceptional authority, when trust replaced procedure as the governing principle, when the right person in the right position could accomplish what committees and regulations could never achieve. The philosophy required judgment about people that Roosevelt believed he possessed and that his record suggested he actually did possess. Hopkins was not the only beneficiary of this approach. George Marshall had received similar trust, similar authority, similar protection against interference that would have constrained lesser appointees. Stalin's approach inverted every element of Roosevelt's philosophy. Where Roosevelt trusted, Stalin suspected. Where Roosevelt delegated, Stalin controlled. Where Roosevelt defended his subordinates against criticism, Stalin encouraged criticism as a tool of maintaining fear. The Soviet system produced commanders who waited for orders rather than exercising initiative, who sought approval for decisions that battlefield conditions required them to make independently, who understood that success might be rewarded, but failure was certainly be punished with consequences that extended to their families. The American system produced commanders who understood their objectives and were trusted to achieve them through methods they selected themselves. Hopkins had never met Stalin when Roosevelt asked him to travel to Moscow in July 1941, 1 month after the German invasion had begun destroying the Soviet military at rates that suggested the war might end before American assistance could arrive. The mission would bring Roosevelt's philosophy of personal trust into direct contact with Stalin's philosophy of institutional terror. Hopkins would see what fear had created. He would report what survival required. The logic that governed Stalin's control of his military was not irrational. This was the element that foreign observers, including Hopkins when he eventually reached Moscow, found most difficult to comprehend. Stalin micromanaged because he had systematically destroyed the alternative to micromanagement. The purge that had killed Tukhachevsky and imprisoned Rokossovsky and eliminated over 11,000 officers had not been an aberration or an excess. It had been a deliberate restructuring of the relationship between political authority and military competence. Stalin had chosen to rule an institution incapable of independent action rather than trust an institution capable of independent thought. Zhukov understood this logic because he had survived within it. The officers who served under his command in January 1942 had learned the same lessons he had learned. Initiative was dangerous. Independent judgment was suspect. Success that could not be attributed to Stalin's genius was success that threatened rather than served. A division commander who modified his orders based on battlefield conditions risked accusations that he had deviated from approved plans. A corps commander who achieved victory through methods his superiors had not specified risked questions about why those methods had not been reported for approval before implementation. The safest course was always to follow orders precisely, to fail conventionally rather than succeed unconventionally, to document every decision in reports that demonstrated compliance from directives above. The system produced predictable results. Soviet operations in the winter of 1941-1942 were characterized by frontal assaults that tactical flexibility might have avoided, by delays while commanders sought authorization that battlefield tempo did not permit, by opportunities lost because the officers who recognized them lacked the authority to exploit them. The German commanders operating under a system that still permitted initiative at lower levels maneuvered around Soviet forces that possessed numerical superiority but could not translate numbers into operational advantage. The Wehrmacht was losing the war of attrition. It was winning the war of adaptation, and adaptation required exactly the kind of independent judgment that Stalin had spent 4 years eliminating. The pressure of military necessity began forcing changes that ideology would never have permitted. Stalin could not personally approve every artillery barrage, could not review every battalion movement, could not exercise the detailed control that his suspicion demanded across a front stretching over 1,000 kilometers. The communications infrastructure did not exist. The time did not exist. The war was moving faster than centralized command could process, and the war would not slow down to accommodate the preferences of the supreme commander. Zhukov observed the adaptation in meetings where Stalin's questions became slightly less granular, where approval came slightly more quickly, where the threat implied in every interaction receded slightly towards something that might, in another system, have been called professional discussion. The changes were incomplete, they were grudging, they were revocable at any moment if Stalin decided that delegation had proceeded too far, or if a commander's reputation had grown too prominent. But they were real, extracted from Stalin by circumstances that his personality could not accept and his survival could not avoid. The contrast with Washington could not have been more complete. George Marshall spent January 1942 building systems designed to push authority downward, to identify commanders capable of independent judgment, to create institutional structures that would function without his personal intervention in operational details. He selected Dwight Eisenhower for the War Plans Division not because Eisenhower agreed with Marshall's views, but because Eisenhower demonstrated the capacity to form and defend his own views. He reorganized the Army's command structure to eliminate bureaucratic layers that slowed decision-making. He delegated because delegation multiplied his effectiveness, because one man could not personally direct a global war, because the officers he trusted would make better decisions with authority than they would make while waiting for approval. Stalin delegated because he had no choice. Marshall delegated because he understood that delegation was the only path to victory. The distinction was philosophical, but its consequences were operational. American commanders in 1942 were learning to exercise initiative. Soviet commanders in 1942 were learning that survival might, under certain circumstances, temporarily permit initiative. The lessons each group learned would shape the armies they built and the victories they eventually achieved. The test of Roosevelt's trust in Marshall came within weeks of Pearl Harbor, in a debate that would determine whether American strategy served political expedience or military logic. The American public wanted revenge against Japan. The newspapers that shaped opinion demanded Pacific priority. Douglas MacArthur, commanding the doomed defense of the Philippines from a tunnel on Corregidor, had become a symbol of resistance whose requests for reinforcement carried emotional weight that strategic analysis could not match. Admiral Ernest King, the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, believed that the Navy's war was the Pacific War and argued for resources that would make the Pacific the primary theater. Marshall disagreed. He sat in meetings where the pressure for Pacific priority was palpable, where elected officials invoked constituent anger and military officers invoked wounded pride, and he argued for a strategy that seemed to ignore the enemy who had actually attacked American territory. Germany first, Europe first, the defeat of Hitler before the defeat of Tojo. The logic was sound. Germany was the more dangerous enemy, the one whose industrial capacity and military sophistication posed the greater long-term threat. Defeating Japan while Germany conquered the Soviet Union and consolidated control of Europe would leave America facing a fortress that might never be breached. Defeating Germany first would leave Japan isolated, cut off from allies, vulnerable to the concentrated power that victory in Europe would release. The argument required Marshall to oppose not only public sentiment but powerful figures within his own military establishment. MacArthur's communications from the Philippines carried the weight of men dying while Washington debated priorities. King's naval perspective emphasized the vast distances and the need to prevent Japanese consolidation before counteroffensive became impossible. Both arguments had merit, both advocates had influence, both would have prevailed in a system where the Supreme Commander sought consensus rather than judgment. Roosevelt backed Marshall. The decision was made in meetings that historians would later reconstruct from fragmentary records, in conversations whose content was never fully documented, in the particular alchemy of trust that allowed one man to accept another's judgment on matters where certainty was impossible. Roosevelt did not overrule Marshall's opponents by asserting presidential authority. He supported Marshall's analysis by accepting Marshall's reasoning, by demonstrating to everyone who observed the process that the Army Chief of Staff possessed the President's confidence on strategic questions that would determine whether the war was won or lost. The contrast with Soviet decision-making could not have been more stark. Zhukov had disagreed with Stalin precisely once, in July 1941, when he had argued that Kiev should be abandoned to prevent the encirclement that was clearly developing. Stalin had dismissed him from his position as Chief of the General Staff, had appointed him to command the reserve front, and had proceeded to lose 600,000 soldiers in the Kiev pocket that Zhukov had predicted and Stalin had refused to prevent. The disagreement had not ended Zhukov's career only because the military situation was too desperate to waste competent generals on pride. In better times, disagreement would have ended differently. Soviet marshals who argued against Stalin's strategic preferences did not engage in debates that might change policy. They confessed to treason and were shot, or they learned to present their views as elaborations of Stalin's genius rather than alternatives to it. The institutional knowledge that Marshall accumulated through genuine discussion with capable subordinates simply did not exist in the Soviet system. Stalin received information filtered through fear, analysis shaped by survival calculations, recommendations designed to anticipate what the Supreme Commander wanted to hear rather than what the situation required him to know. Marshall could walk into Roosevelt's office and say that a proposed operation was militarily unsound. He could defend that position against political pressure, against Allied objections, against the preferences of commanders whose egos demanded different answers. He could lose arguments and retain his position, could win arguments and share credit, could function as an advisor whose advice was valued precisely because it was honest. The relationship required trust that Roosevelt had chosen to extend and Marshall had earned through performance. The relationship produced strategy that reflected military reality rather than political convenience or personal terror. The Germany First decision held. American resources flowed to Europe in proportions that Pacific commanders considered inadequate and European planners considered essential. The trust that made the decision possible would be tested again, in circumstances that would ask Marshall to sacrifice his own ambitions for the strategy he had advocated. November 13, 1942, 1:30 a.m. Moscow, the Kremlin. Georgy Zhukov stood before Stalin's desk for the fourth time in 6 days, presenting modifications to an operational plan that Stalin had already approved and could not stop questioning. The office smelled of pipe tobacco and the cold tea that sat in cups no one drank, the remnants of meetings that stretched through nights when sleep was a luxury that supreme commanders did not permit themselves or their subordinates. Maps of the Germany sector covered every horizontal surface, marked with unit positions and arrows indicating movements that would either encircle the German Sixth Army or fail catastrophically and lose the war. Operation Uranus was Zhukov's conception, developed in collaboration with Alexander Vasilevsky over weeks of analysis that had produced an elegant simplicity. German forces were concentrated in Stalingrad itself, grinding through the city in block-by-block combat that consumed divisions without producing decision. The flanks of this concentration were held by Romanian armies, whose equipment was inferior and whose commitment to German victory was questionable. Two massive Soviet thrusts, one from the north and one from the south, would break through the Romanian positions and converge west of Stalingrad, trapping the Germans in a pocket from which escape would be impossible. Stalin had approved the plan on September 13th. He had questioned it on September 15th. He had demanded modifications on September 20th, changes that Zhukov incorporated while preserving the essential concept. He had approved the modifications on October 28th. He had questioned the modified plan on October 3rd. The pattern continued through autumn, a cycle of approval and doubt that reflected Stalin's inability to trust judgments he had not personally verified, operations he could not personally control, commanders whose success might produce reputations that rivaled his own. The interference was not merely psychological. Stalin's questions required answers that consumed time Zhukov needed for coordination. Meetings at 2 in the morning meant that orders drafted at 4 in the morning reached commanders who had to implement them while exhausted. The NKVD officers who monitored every communication ensured that nothing moved without documentation that could later be reviewed for evidence of deviation, conspiracy, or insufficient enthusiasm. The machinery of suspicion operated alongside the machinery of war, consuming resources that military operations required and producing nothing except fear. Zhukov answered Stalin's questions with the patience that survival demanded. Yes, the tank reserves were positioned correctly. No, the artillery concentrations had not been modified since the last briefing. Yes, the Romanian positions had been reconnoitered. No, the intelligence on German dispositions had not materially changed since yesterday's report. The questions were redundant, the answers were repetitive. The ritual continued because Stalin needed reassurance that his authority remained absolute even over operations he lacked the expertise to evaluate. The attack began on November 19th, 6 days after the final midnight meeting in Stalin's office. Zhukov was not at Stalingrad when the artillery barrage announced the offensive's opening. He had been sent to the Kalinin front, 400 kilometers to the north, to supervise a diversionary operation that would prevent German reserves from reinforcing the encirclement. The assignment was militarily reasonable. It was also politically convenient. If Uranus succeeded, Stalin would be present at the decisive theater. If it failed, Zhukov would be associated with a secondary front whose failure could be blamed on local commanders. The operation succeeded beyond what planning had projected. Romanian divisions collapsed within hours, their positions overrun by tank formations that had been assembled in secrecy that German intelligence had failed to penetrate. The northern and southern pincers converged at Kalach on November 23rd, closing a ring around over 250,000 German soldiers. The Sixth Army was trapped. The war had turned. Stalin announced the victory in communications that emphasized his personal direction of the operation. Zhukov received credit appropriate to a subordinate who had implemented the Supreme Commander's vision. The distinction was not merely rhetorical, it reflected a truth about Soviet command that no operational success could alter. Victories belonged to Stalin, failures belonged to generals, and the distance between triumph and execution remained always within Stalin's power to determine. Zhukov had planned the battle. Zhukov had organized the forces. Zhukov had answered midnight questions while exhaustion accumulated. The victory was Stalin's. July 30th, 1941, 6:30 p.m., Moscow, the Kremlin. Harry Hopkins walked through corridors that smelled of floor polish, tobacco smoke, and something else beneath it all, something he would later describe to Roosevelt as the particular atmosphere of a building where fear had become architectural, embedded in the walls themselves. He had arrived in Moscow 2 days earlier, traveling through a route that had taken him from Washington to London to Archangel, a journey of nearly 2 weeks across oceans where German submarines hunted and skies where German aircraft patrolled. Roosevelt had sent him to answer a single question: would the Soviet Union survive long enough for American assistance to matter? Hopkins was 51 years old and looked older. The chronic digestive illness that had plagued him for years had intensified during the journey, leaving him gaunt in ways that alarmed the embassy staff who received him. He weighed barely 126 pounds. Doctors had warned him that the trip might kill him. He had accepted the warning as information rather than prohibition, understanding that Roosevelt needed answers that no one else could obtain, and that obtaining them required risks that medical opinion could not overrule. The German invasion had been underway for 38 days, the reports reaching Washington through diplomatic channels and intelligence assessments painted a picture of catastrophe so complete that many American military officers considered Soviet collapse inevitable. German armies had advanced over 500 kilometers. Soviet losses exceeded 2 million soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The Luftwaffe had destroyed thousands of aircraft on the ground in the invasion's opening hours. The defensive lines that should have slowed the German advance had been breached, encircled, annihilated. Professional opinion in Washington and London held that the Soviet Union would fall within weeks, that any resources sent to support the Russian front would be resources wasted on a corpse. Harry Hopkins had been sent to verify this assessment by meeting the man who would determine whether this assessment was accurate. Stalin received him in the same office where Zhukov would later stand at attention through midnight interrogations, at a desk covered with maps that documented disasters Hopkins could read without translation. The Supreme Commander's questions were direct, probing, designed to determine whether this American emissary represented serious commitment or empty gestures. Hopkins answered with equal directness, explaining what Roosevelt could promise and what American industrial capacity could deliver if the Soviet Union remained in the war long enough to receive it. What Hopkins observed during 2 days of meetings would shape Roosevelt's understanding of an ally whose methods contradicted everything American democracy represented. He saw the fear in subordinates who entered Stalin's presence, the careful calibration of responses designed to avoid triggering suspicion, the absolute authority that reduced marshals to clerks awaiting instructions. He saw a system that had crippled itself through purges, whose scale he could only estimate from the absences he noticed, positions held by men too young and too inexperienced for the responsibilities they carried. He saw terror institutionalized into command relationships that made initiative impossible and obedience mandatory. He also saw something that the professional assessments in Washington had missed. Stalin was not panicking. The Supreme Commander who had ignored warnings and forbidden preparations was now directing operations with a focus that catastrophe had sharpened rather than broken. The system was damaged, perhaps crippled, but it was not collapsing. The Russian capacity for absorbing punishment that would have destroyed other nations was revealing itself in resistance that the Germans had not anticipated and could not understand. Hopkins watched Stalin mark maps with positions that represented divisions that no longer existed at full strength and reinforcements that had not yet arrived, and he saw a man who intended to fight regardless of what professional opinion in Washington or London predicted. His report to Roosevelt was unequivocal. The Soviet Union would survive. American assistance would not be wasted. The alliance that would eventually destroy Nazi Germany was worth the investment that skeptics considered futile. Hopkins had seen Stalin's system from inside, had witnessed its cruelties and its costs, had understood that the methods appalled everything he believed about human dignity and political organization. None of that changed his conclusion. The Soviet Union would fight. America should help. The rest was detail. December 6, 1943, 4:45 p.m., Cairo, Egypt, Mina House Hotel. George Marshall sat in a room overlooking the pyramids of Giza, waiting for a decision that would determine whether his career culminated in the greatest military command in history or continued in the administrative role he had performed since Pearl Harbor. The air smelled of desert dust, cigarette smoke, and the particular tension that accumulated when powerful men gathered to allocate glory. Roosevelt was meeting with Churchill in the adjacent suite, discussing the command of Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion that would open the Second Front Stalin had been demanding since 1941. Marshall's name had been attached to that command for over a year. Everyone assumed it was his. Marshall died on October 16, 1959, in Washington, D.C., 78 years old. His funeral at the Washington National Cathedral was attended by President Eisenhower, the man Marshall had selected for commands that made Eisenhower's subsequent career possible. The general, who had never led troops in combat, was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, with honors that acknowledged what his leadership had accomplished without ever permitting him the glory of personal command. He had built the army that won the war. He had selected the generals who received the credit. He had accepted the arrangement because duty required acceptance, and Marshall understood duty better than he understood ambition. Georgy Zhukov's fate illustrated what the Soviet system did to commanders whose abilities had become inconvenient. He had accepted the German surrender in Berlin, had commanded the victory parade in Moscow, had accumulated a reputation that post-war Soviet leadership found threatening. Stalin demoted him in 1946, assigned him to command the Odessa military district, removed him from the prominence that his achievements had earned. The demotion was not execution, it was exile, a reminder that survival in the Soviet system was always provisional, and that gratitude was not a concept that applied to relationships between supreme commanders and the generals who served them. Stalin's death in 1953 brought partial rehabilitation. Zhukov served as defense minister under Khrushchev, helped suppress the Hungarian uprising of 1956, accumulated power that made him once again dangerous to political leaders who feared military independence. Khrushchev dismissed him in 1957, accused him of cultivating a personality cult, stripped him of positions that his abilities had justified and his loyalty had earned. He spent his final years writing memoirs that were censored before publication, attending ceremonies where his presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, observing the system he had saved treat his service as a threat requiring management rather than an achievement deserving honor. Zhukov died on June 18, 1974, in Moscow, 77 years old. His funeral was attended by Soviet leadership whose predecessors had exiled him and whose successors would rehabilitate his memory. The general who had planned Stalingrad and taken Berlin was buried with honors that acknowledged his military achievements while ignoring the system that had punished him for possessing them. Two systems had produced victory. Only one had produced leaders who survived their usefulness. The distinction was not efficiency. The distinction was what power meant to the men who held it, and what it cost the men who served it.